An ordinary evening in the park for 11-year-old Leila turned into a nightmare when a police officer approached her unexpectedly. No one could have predicted what would happen next. You won't believe what happened. Watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments. It was a quiet, warm evening, and the golden light of the setting sun cast a soft glow over the park. Leila, an 11-year-old girl with curly hair that danced whenever the wind caught it, was sitting peacefully on a park bench, enjoying the fading colors of the sky. She loved this time of day when the world seemed to calm down, wrapping itself in a blanket of evening calm. Her father, Michael Jennings, was a police captain and one of the most respected officers in the community. He had allowed Leila a little more time at the park today, promising her he would stay nearby and keep an eye on her. She liked feeling a little bit independent, like she had her own slice of the world in that park, even if her dad was somewhere close by. Her mind drifted as she thought about her school friends, her favorite books, and her plans for the weekend. The park was nearly empty, with only a few people scattered around, most of them preparing to leave. She noticed a man in a police uniform approaching her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. At first, she assumed he was just doing his rounds, checking in on the people still at the park before nightfall. As he drew closer, Leila's initial sense of security shifted, replaced by a strange, uneasy feeling she couldn't quite understand. The man's eyes lingered on her a bit too long, and his smile seemed forced, almost unnaturally friendly. Leila clutched her small backpack a little tighter, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric as if it could somehow shield her from the discomfort growing within her. "Hey there, young lady," the man greeted her, leaning down a little as he spoke. His voice was overly sweet, almost condescending, like he was talking to a toddler instead of an 11-year-old. "What's your name?" Leila hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Her father had taught her to be polite but cautious, especially with strangers, even if they seemed friendly. Something about this man's tone made her instinctively wary. "Leila," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced around the park, hoping to spot her father, but he was nowhere in sight. He had mentioned that he would stay close, but maybe he had stepped away for a moment. She tried to keep her expression calm, not wanting to seem rude. "That's a pretty name," the officer said, his eyes still fixed on her. "How old are you, Leila?" Leila felt a chill run down her spine. His questions felt intrusive, far beyond what any friendly adult would ask. 11, she replied, her voice even quieter this time. She wanted to stand up and walk away, but something in his gaze made her feel like she couldn't move. The officer, whose badge read R. Thomas, didn't break eye contact. Instead, he took a step closer, his smile widening, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You know, it's pretty late for a young girl like you to be out here all alone. Is someone here with you?" Leila's heart pounded. She wanted to say her father was nearby, but the words caught in her throat. Fear began to take root, spreading like ice through her chest. She managed a small nod, hoping it would be enough to make him go away, but instead he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, almost too strong for what should have been a simple gesture of reassurance. Leila flinched, instinctively pulling back, but his hand tightened slightly, keeping her in place. The officer's face remained calm, but his eyes held a strange intensity that frightened her. Her mind raced, and she could feel her body tensing, every instinct screaming at her to get away. "Hey, there's no need to be scared," he said, his hand sliding down her shoulder toward her arm. "I'm just looking out for you, okay? Making sure you're safe." Leila's breath hitched as his hand continued its downward path, moving closer to her leg. The world around her seemed to blur, and she realized that she was holding her breath, her body frozen in fear. She wanted to scream, to call out for her father, but the shock and disbelief held her voice captive. Her vision blurred as her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The officer's hand finally reached her thigh, his fingers pressing gently but uncomfortably against her leg. Panic surged within her, breaking through the paralyzing fear, and she found her voice. "Stop!" she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Let go of me!" Her cry pierced the stillness of the park, drawing the attention of a few distant passers-by. In that moment, Leila spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Her father, Captain Michael Jennings, his gaze already fixed on her with an expression of pure horror. She could see him running toward her, his face a mix of fear and anger that she had never seen before. The officer's grip on her thigh tightened for a brief moment before he finally released her, stepping back as he noticed Michael approaching. But rather than retreating, he straightened up, his expression shifting to one of challenge as he sized up the man rushing toward them. "Step away from her!" Michael's voice boomed across the park, his tone carrying a command that left no room for argument. Leila had never seen her father like this. His usual calm, authoritative demeanor was replaced by a fierce protectiveness that bordered on fury. She took a shaky step back, her heart still racing as she watched her father confront the officer. The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't back down. Instead, he raised his chin defiantly, as though daring Michael to take it further. "Is there a problem here, sir?" R. Thomas asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Don't play games with me," Michael replied, his voice barely controlled. He glanced at Leila, his gaze softening for just a moment before hardening again as he turned back to the officer. "I saw everything. You put your hands on my daughter. I want you to back away from her right now." The tension between them was palpable, thickening the air with a sense of impending conflict. A small crowd had begun to gather, whispering amongst themselves as they watched the confrontation unfold. Leila clung to her backpack, her small frame trembling with residual fear as she stayed close to her father. "Look," R. Thomas said, his voice suddenly cold, "you're blowing this way out of proportion. I was just trying to make sure the girl was safe." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, and his eyes flashed with a fury that Leila had never seen before. "You had no right to touch her. Do you even know who I am?" R. Thomas sneered, his expression twisting with disdain. "No, and frankly, I don't care. What are you going to do about it?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder, tension crackling between the two men. Leila held her breath, feeling the fear rising again as she watched her father square off against the officer who had frightened her so deeply. Without warning, R. Thomas took a step toward Michael, his stance aggressive. "I don't take orders from anyone, especially not some random guy who thinks he's in charge." Michael's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he took a steadying breath. "I'm Captain Michael Jennings of the City Police Department, and you've crossed a line you'll regret." For a moment, R. Thomas's face faltered, the realization sinking in. But just as quickly he shrugged it off, a bitter grin spreading across his face. "Captain, huh? Well, looks like rank doesn't mean much out here." The next moment passed in a blur as R. Thomas's fist swung through the air, landing a hard blow against Michael's face. The force of the punch staggered him and the crowd gasped, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Leila screamed, her voice a mixture of terror and helplessness as she watched her father stumble back. The officer's attack continued, each punch more brutal than the last, and Leila could only watch, frozen in horror, as her father fell to the ground. Captain Michael Jennings lay on the ground, stunned and reeling from the impact of Officer Thomas's blows. Leila's scream echoed in his mind, her terrified voice slicing through the haze of pain as he struggled to gather his strength. His mind raced as he processed what had just happened. The officer, meant to protect, had crossed every conceivable line, attacking him in full view of his daughter and the gathering crowd. Michael felt a surge of anger rise within him, overriding the pain and shock. This was more than a personal affront. This was a betrayal of everything he stood for as a police captain. Ignoring the throbbing ache in his jaw, he pushed himself up slowly, determination flashing in his eyes as he locked onto Officer Thomas. But before he could respond, he noticed the officer's face was twisted into a sneer, as though enjoying every second of the confrontation. "Didn't know your fancy rank makes you immune to a little confrontation, Captain," Thomas taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. Michael stood to his full height, squaring his shoulders. "You're assaulting a superior officer, Thomas, in front of witnesses. You've crossed the line. Badly." His words came out strong, steady, though every nerve in his body was on edge, ready to protect Leila at all costs. He was well aware of the eyes on him, some horrified, others recording every second of the encounter. "Superior?" Thomas scoffed, glancing over at Leila, who was trembling behind her father, clutching her backpack as if it were a lifeline. He turned back to Michael, shrugging off his words. "As far as I can see, you're just a man in my way. Now, I'll give you one last chance to back off." The crowd murmured, some people moving closer, others shouting for help. Michael could see a few concerned faces in the crowd, their phones out, capturing every moment, a testament to this officer's reckless actions. Despite the chaos around him, Michael kept his focus, taking a step back to shield Leila, aware that any move he made could further enrage Thomas. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Michael noticed blue and red flashing lights approaching rapidly. Reinforcements. Relief washed over him, but he remained on high alert, knowing that Thomas was unpredictable and increasingly agitated. "Look around, Thomas," Michael said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. "Help is here, and it's over. Step back and let this end without more disgrace." But instead of backing down, Thomas sneered again, rolling his shoulders as if preparing to fight. The growing tension around him seemed to embolden him rather than subdue him. "Help? For you? You think your badge will protect you now, Captain?" A couple of officers approached, stepping out of their squad car, looking between Thomas and Captain Jennings, trying to understand the chaotic scene in front of them. The first officer who arrived, Officer Daniels, approached cautiously, clearly taken aback as he recognized Captain Jennings. "Captain Jennings?" Daniels asked, confused, his gaze darting from Michael to Thomas, his hand hovering over his radio. "Daniels." Michael addressed him directly, his voice calm and controlled. "Detain this officer." His command cut through the noise and confusion, causing Daniels to look sharply at Thomas, the severity of the situation sinking in. The crowd continued to murmur and gasp, every moment adding fuel to the growing tension around them. Thomas seemed to realize that he was losing control of the situation. He scowled, turning to Daniels with an indignant expression. "Don't even think about it. I'm the one in control here." His voice held a note of desperation now, his defiance beginning to waver, as he saw the firm resolve in the other officers' faces. Officer Daniels took a step forward, his expression firm. "Thomas, you need to back down. Now, this is an order." But instead of complying, Thomas swung his fist again, this time aiming at Daniels. Daniels managed to dodge the blow just in time, stepping back to avoid the impact. His face hardened, his jaw set in a line of determination. "Enough!" he barked, his voice ringing with authority. "Thomas, you're under arrest for assaulting a superior officer. Put your hands up." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd as they watched the drama unfold. Thomas, cornered and desperate, glared at the officers around him, his defiance crumbling as he realized the consequences of his actions. His face twisted in anger and frustration, but he finally raised his hands, allowing Daniels to restrain him. Leila, still shaken and clutching her backpack, watched in a daze as Officer Daniels handcuffed Thomas. She could barely believe what had just happened. The fear, the anger, and the overwhelming relief that it was finally over. Her father was safe, and the man who had frightened her was being taken away. Michael turned to his daughter, his face softening as he saw the fear still lingering in her eyes. He reached out, gently placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over now, Leila," he said quietly, his voice steady, though he couldn't ignore the unease that still lingered within him. She nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and confusion as she clung to him, still visibly shaken. The crowd began to disperse, though a few people lingered, offering words of comfort to Leila and Michael, their faces filled with empathy and understanding. As Officer Daniels led Thomas away, Michael watched, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The assault, the blatant disregard for authority, the breach of trust, all of it weighed heavily on him. His heart ached for his daughter, who had just experienced something no child should ever face. Daniels returned after placing Thomas in the squad car, his expression grave. "Captain Jennings, I'm sorry. I don't know what got into him." Michael nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Neither do I. But I'll make sure he faces the consequences for this. It's not just about what he did to me, it's about what he put my daughter through. There's no place for people like him in our force." Daniels nodded in agreement, glancing over at Leila, who was still clinging to her father, visibly shaken but trying to be brave. The sight of her seemed to bolster his resolve. "We'll get the full report, Captain," Daniels said, his tone respectful. "If there's anything else you need, we're here to help." Michael offered a nod of appreciation, though his mind was elsewhere, already planning the steps he would take to ensure this incident would not be ignored. It was about more than just justice for himself or Leila. It was about sending a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated, not under his watch. As the squad cars pulled away, taking Officer Thomas into custody, Michael bent down to meet Leila's eyes, his expression softening. "Leila, are you okay?" She nodded slowly, though the fear still lingered in her gaze. I was so scared, Daddy." Michael wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but you were brave, and it's over now. He won't be able to hurt anyone else." They stood there for a long moment, father and daughter, surrounded by the fading light of the evening and the reassuring presence of the officers who had come to their aid. The incident at the park had quickly become the talk of the town, spreading like wildfire through news outlets and social media. Within hours, countless videos taken by witnesses had surfaced online, showing every moment of the shocking confrontation between Captain Michael Jennings and Officer Thomas. In the grainy footage, viewers could see Thomas's reckless behavior, his unwarranted aggression toward Michael, and his vile disregard for Leila's fear. The world was watching, and the public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. As headlines called for justice, the police department responded with urgency. Officer Thomas was officially placed under investigation, and the city held a press conference condemning his actions. The mayor addressed the incident directly, promising a full inquiry and emphasizing that the behavior displayed by Officer Thomas did not represent the values of their city or its police force. The atmosphere in the city was tense, with protests springing up almost overnight as people demanded accountability. Meanwhile, Michael found himself at the center of an emotional and exhausting storm. On one hand, he was inundated with support from people both inside and outside the department who stood by him, outraged by the injustice he and his daughter had suffered. On the other hand, he was grappling with the deep psychological impact the incident had left on Leila. She hadn't spoken much since that night in the park. Her normally lively, cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a quiet, withdrawn silence that worried him deeply. Leila had started to suffer from nightmares, waking in the middle of the night with tears streaming down her face, clinging to her father as though afraid he might disappear too. Each time, Michael would sit with her, stroking her hair and whispering words of comfort, though he couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at him. Despite being there for her physically, he felt that he had somehow failed to protect her from the horrors she had witnessed. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt shadowed by the trauma they were both trying to process. In those moments alone with Leila, Michael made a vow to do everything in his power to seek justice, not only for himself, but, more importantly, for his daughter. No child should have to live with the kind of fear that now plagued her, and he was determined to make sure Thomas faced the full weight of the law. The investigation moved swiftly, with interviews from the witnesses who had been present at the park and statements from the officers who had responded to the scene. The overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt about Thomas's guilt. As more details emerged, it became clear that this incident was far from an isolated case. Several other complaints against Thomas surfaced, revealing a pattern of abuse and misconduct that had gone unaddressed for far too long. This new information only fueled the public's demand for justice. Protesters took to the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for Leila" and "End Abuse of Power." They gathered outside the police department and City Hall, chanting and calling for reform. The incident had touched a nerve, sparking a conversation about the abuse of authority and the urgent need for accountability within the police force. Michael watched the news coverage from home, feeling a mix of relief and responsibility. People were standing up, not just for him and Leila, but for every person who had ever faced injustice at the hands of those meant to protect them. As the day of the trial approached, Michael prepared himself to face Thomas in court. He spent hours with his lawyer, going over every detail of that night, ensuring there were no gaps in their case. Leila would not be required to testify, something he was immensely grateful for. He couldn't bear the thought of her reliving that night in a public courtroom, but he knew his own testimony would be critical, and he steeled himself for the intense emotions it would likely bring up. On the morning of the trial, Michael and Leila arrived at the courthouse surrounded by a swarm of reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward him as they shouted questions. Shielding Leila from the overwhelming crowd, he guided her inside, nodding briefly to the officers posted at the entrance who offered him looks of support. Once seated in the courtroom, Michael glanced around, his gaze settling on Thomas, who sat across from him, his expression unreadable. Despite the damning evidence against him, Thomas showed no remorse. In fact, he seemed almost defiant, his jaw set in a stubborn line as though refusing to acknowledge the gravity of his actions. The trial proceeded quickly, with the prosecution presenting video evidence, witness testimonies, and Michael's own statement recounting the events of that night. The videos played on the large screen in the courtroom, showing the world the truth of what had happened. Michael's heart pounded as he relived those moments, each scene reminding him of the fear in Leila's eyes and the anger that had surged through him. When it was finally time for him to take the stand, Michael held his head high, his voice steady as he recounted every detail, every word exchanged, every blow Thomas had landed. His gaze remained fixed on the judge, his resolve unwavering as he spoke, determined to ensure that Thomas would answer for his actions. As the prosecution rested its case, Thomas's defense lawyer attempted to paint him as a well-intentioned officer who had simply been doing his job. But the evidence was irrefutable, and the jury's faces told a clear story. They were not convinced by the flimsy excuses or the attempts to downplay the severity of Thomas's actions. The truth was plain for everyone to see. Thomas had abused his power, and he had to face the consequences. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Thomas was sentenced to prison, stripped of his badge, and banned from ever serving in law enforcement again. The court erupted into a mix of silence and relief as the sentence was announced, and Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served. When they stepped outside, the crowd gathered around them, cheering and applauding as Michael and Leila emerged from the courthouse. A few people came forward, offering Leila flowers, small gestures of kindness that seemed to touch her deeply. She managed a shy smile, clutching the flowers close, though her grip on her father's hand remained tight. As they made their way home that evening, Leila turned to Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really over now, Daddy?" she asked, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Michael knelt down, looking her directly in the eyes as he nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over. He can't hurt anyone anymore." His voice was steady, though he felt the weight of everything they had endured pressing down on him. But he knew that, for the first time in days, they could finally begin to heal. In the days that followed, Michael made good on his vow to create change within the department. He began working with city officials and community leaders, pushing for reforms that would hold officers accountable and prevent abuses of power. He spoke at public forums, sharing his experience and urging others to stand up for justice. Leila, too, began to show signs of healing. Though the trauma of that night would likely stay with her for years to come, she found strength in the support of her family and friends. She returned to her normal routines, though a part of her innocence had been irrevocably changed by the events she had witnessed. But despite the pain, there was hope. Leila and Michael had endured a difficult journey, one marked by fear, anger, and resilience, and in the end they had found justice, not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Together, they would continue to fight for a future where children like Leila could feel safe, knowing that those sworn to protect them were truly worthy of that trust. The weeks following the trial were filled with mixed emotions for Michael and his daughter Leila. On one hand, there was a sense of relief. Officer Thomas was now in prison, his authority stripped away, and he would no longer pose a threat to anyone. The outpouring of public support had been overwhelming, with countless messages, flowers, and letters of encouragement sent to their home. People across the city, and even beyond, had reached out to express their solidarity and admiration for their courage. It was clear that their story had touched hearts and stirred people into action. But alongside the relief was a lingering pain, a wound that no amount of external support could fully heal. Leila had suffered deeply from that night in the park. The bright, bubbly child who had once filled their home with laughter had grown quieter, her smile dimmed by an experience no child should ever have to endure. Michael watched helplessly as she retreated further into herself, withdrawing from the world around her, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The nightmares persisted. Each night, as darkness settled over their home, Leila's fears returned to haunt her, manifesting in dreams that left her gasping for breath, her small hands gripping her sheets tightly as if she could somehow hold on to safety. She would wake up crying, reaching for her father, and Michael would sit with her, whispering reassurances, but he knew his words alone couldn't erase what she had been through. Her trauma began to affect her everyday life as well. Simple outings, things that used to bring her joy, now filled her with dread. The park, once her favorite place, had become a sight of terror that she couldn't bear to revisit. Even the sight of a police uniform, once a symbol of her father's pride and dedication, now brought tears to her eyes. Michael's heart ached to see his daughter struggling, burdened by memories that even adults would find hard to carry. Despite his own pain, Michael focused on helping Leila heal. He brought her to a therapist who specialized in working with children, someone who could guide her through the process of understanding and processing her trauma. It was a slow journey, with many setbacks along the way. Some days, Leila would seem almost like her old self, talking excitedly about her favorite books or a show she had watched. But other days were harder, with long silences, tear-filled eyes, and questions that were difficult for her young mind to articulate. Michael struggled with his own feelings as well. He carried a deep guilt, a feeling that he had somehow failed to protect Leila from harm, even though he had been right there. He replayed that night over and over in his mind, wondering if there was something, anything, he could have done differently. His role as a father was to keep his child safe, yet the memory of her frightened eyes haunted him, a constant reminder of the terror she had faced. Determined to prevent others from suffering as they had, Michael threw himself into his work, championing changes within the police department that would hold officers accountable for their actions. He proposed stricter measures for handling complaints, including mandatory reviews for any reports of misconduct, and pushed for the establishment of a civilian oversight board that would act as an independent body, investigating cases where officers had abused their power. His efforts gained momentum, fueled by the public's demand for justice and reform, and soon his proposals were being discussed at the highest levels of the city's administration. Meanwhile, Leila's healing journey continued. The support she received from her therapist, her friends, and her family began to show small signs of progress. She started to smile more, even laugh on occasion, though her laughter was tinged with a wisdom far beyond her years. One evening, after dinner, she sat down with Michael and, for the first time, opened up about her feelings. "Daddy, will I ever feel safe again?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. Michael's heart broke at her words, but he reached out, taking her small hands in his. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "It will take time, but you will feel safe again, and I'll be here with you every step of the way." His words seemed to comfort her, and she nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Though he knew the road ahead was long, that moment gave him hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had surrounded them. The following weeks brought more progress. Leila returned to school, though she remained cautious, staying close to her friends and avoiding any situations that might bring up memories of that night. Her teachers, aware of what she had been through, were gentle with her, offering her support and understanding as she slowly adjusted to the routines of her life. She began to regain her confidence, finding strength in the love and encouragement that surrounded her. As Leila found her footing, Michael continued his fight for change within the police force. His efforts were met with resistance by some, particularly those who saw his push for accountability as a threat to the department's authority. But Michael remained steadfast, determined to make a difference not only for Leila, but for every person who had ever been a victim of abuse of power. In time, Michael's persistence paid off. The city council passed a series of reforms aimed at improving transparency within the police department, and the new Civilian Oversight Board was established, marking a significant victory in the fight for justice. The changes were met with celebration by the community, who viewed them as a step toward a safer, more just future. Throughout it all, Leila remained his guiding light, her resilience a constant reminder of why he had embarked on this journey. Her strength inspired him, and together they began to rebuild their lives, creating new memories that would help overshadow the pain of the past. In the end, Leila's journey of healing became a symbol of hope, not only for her family, but for an entire community. Her bravery, combined with Michael's dedication, had sparked a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on the city and pave the way for a brighter, safer future. The night of the incident remained a fresh scar in the minds of everyone who had been present, but for Michael, it felt like a weight he carried each day. While Officer Thomas had been sentenced and removed from the force, the echoes of his actions had shaken the entire city. The media coverage of the case, the heated debates it sparked in City Hall, and the countless community discussions that followed had brought to light just how much work was needed to restore trust in law enforcement. Michael had known it wouldn't be easy, but seeing his daughter struggle made him more determined than ever. Leila, once a carefree, joyful 11-year-old, now bore the weight of an experience that no child should endure. She would often retreat into silence, her laughter less frequent, her smile softened by a shadow of uncertainty. It was hard for Michael to accept. His bright little girl seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. To help Leila through the aftermath, Michael enlisted the help of a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. It was important to him that she had a safe space to share her fears and feelings, a place where she could gradually release the hold that night had on her. He sat with her as she went through each session, hearing her describe how she felt betrayed by the world around her, how the sight of a police uniform filled her with dread. She couldn't shake the image of Thomas's face, his cruel smile as he had refused to let go of her, as he had spoken to her in that way that still made her shiver whenever she thought of it. At home, Michael dedicated every moment he had to supporting her, even as he dealt with his own pain. He stayed up through her nightmares, holding her hand when she woke up in tears, assuring her that he was there and that no one would ever hurt her again. Leila's resilience surprised him. Despite the fear and lingering trauma, she showed courage in her own way, often trying to hide her tears so he wouldn't worry. But Michael could see through her brave face. He knew that even the strongest hearts sometimes needed time to heal. Meanwhile, Michael was not just a father seeking justice for his daughter. He was also a captain, responsible for leading a team of officers and holding them to a standard of respect and accountability. He took his role seriously and knew that this incident had eroded the public's trust. Determined to make a difference, he threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, pushing for internal reforms that would hold officers accountable. Michael called for mandatory evaluations of conduct, regular sensitivity training, and stronger guidelines for handling complaints. Despite his best efforts, not everyone was on board. The proposed changes were met with resistance from within the department. Some of the older officers, who had grown comfortable with the existing system, viewed Michael's efforts as unnecessary interference. They resented the increased scrutiny, seeing it as a threat to the way things had always been. Tensions within the department grew, and Michael felt the weight of the resistance pressing down on him. But he remained resolute. He knew he was fighting not only for Leila, but for every family who had ever felt powerless, for every person who had ever been mistreated by those in power. He continued to attend city council meetings, speaking out about the importance of accountability and urging lawmakers to implement the proposed changes. Each time he stood before the council, he spoke with the conviction of a father who had seen firsthand the impact of injustice. As his efforts gained momentum, the media took notice. News outlets covered the story of Captain Michael Jennings, the police officer who was leading a movement from within, pushing for reforms to create a safer, more just community. His story resonated with people across the city, and soon he found himself invited to speak at events and community forums where he shared his experiences and his vision for change. Despite the heavy workload, Michael always made time for Leila. Their evenings were spent together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about her day, and gradually he saw glimpses of her old self re-emerging. She still had bad days when the memories seemed too heavy to carry, but she was healing, one step at a time. One evening, after dinner, Leila came to him with a look of determination he hadn't seen in a while. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice steady, "I want to go back to the park." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He knew how much that place represented, how it had become a symbol of everything she had suffered. "Are you sure, Leila? We don't have to rush." She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I want to. I think I need to see it again. Maybe it will help me stop feeling scared." He took her hand, a mixture of pride and concern filling his heart. Together, they returned to the park. The evening was quiet, just as it had been on that fateful night. As they walked past the familiar trees and benches, Michael kept a protective arm around her shoulder, though he sensed that she felt stronger with each step. They reached the bench where she had been sitting that night. Leila looked at it for a long moment, her eyes filled with memories she could never forget. But instead of fear, there was a sense of calm in her gaze. She took a deep breath, releasing a weight she had carried for far too long. "I'm okay now," she whispered, squeezing her father's hand. Michael felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter. She had faced her fears, and he knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The park visit marked a turning point for Leila. Though she would always carry the scars of that night, she had found a strength within herself that even she hadn't known existed. Her laughter returned, and her curiosity about the world began to reemerge. She even took an interest in her father's work, asking questions about his efforts to bring about change within the department. "Will it really help?" she asked one evening as they sat together. "Will it stop other people from getting hurt?" Michael nodded, his voice filled with conviction. "That's the goal, sweetheart. We can't change the past, but we can make things better for the future, for you and for everyone." Leila smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She leaned against him, her small frame fitting perfectly into his embrace. They sat in silence, the bond between them stronger than ever, both of them knowing that they would continue to move forward together. In the weeks that followed, Michael's reforms were officially adopted by the police department. Officers were required to undergo regular evaluations, and a civilian oversight board was established to handle complaints and hold officers accountable. The city hailed the changes as a victory for justice, and Michael became a symbol of hope, a reminder that true strength lay in standing up for what was right. For Leila, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. She returned to school, reconnected with her friends, and began to rebuild her sense of security. The memories of that night would never fully disappear, but they no longer held her captive. She had faced her fears and found a resilience that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. As they walked through the city one sunny afternoon, hand in hand, they were greeted by smiles and words of encouragement from people they passed. Their story had touched countless lives, inspiring others to stand up against injustice and abuse of power. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a movement for change, and their bond was unbreakable. The news of Officer Thomas's sentence and the changes Captain Jennings was implementing reverberated far beyond their city. As articles and news stories shared the details of their case, people across the country took notice. Other cities began to look into their own practices and policies, spurred on by the story of a father and daughter who had courageously fought against abuse of power. Leila, though still healing, found comfort in seeing the world react to their story. The changes her father was pushing for felt like a powerful answer to her experience, as if they were giving a voice to the pain she had endured. Her nights were growing more peaceful, her nightmares fewer. Little by little, she was reclaiming her sense of safety, and, with it, a sense of hope that her father's work was making a difference. Michael, however, knew that change on a wider scale would take time. There were still officers resistant to the new policies, and he faced pushback not only from certain members of the police department, but also from a few powerful figures in the city who preferred to keep things as they were. He had spent hours in meetings defending the new measures he had helped introduce, speaking passionately about the importance of accountability and transparency. There were days when he felt weary, almost overwhelmed, but the memory of his daughter's frightened face reminded him why he had started this fight. One afternoon, he returned home to find Leila waiting for him in the kitchen, her face lit up with excitement. She handed him a small envelope, the kind used for invitations. "Daddy, this came for you," she said, practically bouncing with anticipation. Curious, Michael opened the envelope and pulled out an elegant card. It was an invitation to a ceremony honoring him for his efforts in reforming the police department. The city council had decided to recognize his work publicly, a move that left him both surprised and humbled. "It's a big deal, isn't it?" Leila asked, her eyes shining with pride. Michael smiled, nodding. "It is, sweetheart. But more than that, it means people are finally listening. They're seeing that things need to change." The day of the ceremony arrived, and Michael and Leila, dressed in their best clothes, preparing for what was sure to be a significant moment in their lives. As they entered the city hall, they were greeted by applause from the crowd gathered there, many of them familiar faces, people from their neighborhood, colleagues from the department, friends, and even strangers who had been touched by their story. The ceremony began with speeches from city officials, each one commending Michael for his dedication to justice and his courage in confronting the issues within the department. Michael listened, feeling both grateful and deeply moved. Yet he knew that this was just one step on a longer journey. Change wasn't achieved in a single act. It was something that required constant effort, persistence, and resilience. When it was his turn to speak, Michael took the stage, glancing out at the audience before finding Leila's face in the crowd. She smiled up at him, her eyes filled with encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "This honor isn't just for me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It belongs to my daughter, Leila, who showed unimaginable courage in the face of fear. It belongs to every family who has felt the impact of injustice, and it belongs to each person here who believes that no one, not even those entrusted with power, is above the law." The audience listened intently, some nodding, others with tears in their eyes. Michael continued, his words filled with the passion and determination that had driven him through the difficult months since that night in the park. The journey toward justice and accountability is not easy. There will always be those who resist change, who cling to the way things were. But it's up to us to keep pushing forward, to demand better from those who are meant to protect and serve us. This is just the beginning. The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the hall with the sound of hope and unity. Michael stepped down from the stage, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. A fire rekindled within him. Leila met him halfway, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug, and he could feel the strength and resilience in her embrace. After the ceremony, as they made their way home, Leila was quieter than usual, a thoughtful expression on her face. Michael watched her, wondering what was going through her mind. "Daddy," she finally said, her voice soft, Do you think things will really change?" Michael took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I think things are already changing, Leila, and with every person who stands up for what's right, that change will only grow stronger." She seemed to take comfort in his words, nodding as they walked. He knew that her journey to healing would continue, just as his work to reform the system would remain an ongoing challenge. But as they walked together, father and daughter, he felt hopeful. For himself, for Leila, and for every person whose lives they might touch through their fight for justice. That night, as they settled in for dinner, Leila seemed lighter, a sense of peace in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The journey they had taken had been difficult, filled with pain and challenges they had never anticipated. But in the end, it had also brought them closer, strengthened their bond, and given them a new purpose. And as they sat together, sharing a quiet meal, they both knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, side by side, with courage and hope. Thank you for watching till the end. This story is a reminder that abuse of power can impact anyone. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends. Let us know in the comments what you think about this situation and what you would have done. See you in the next video.